The world of Christian movies has a legion of cheaply produced features, with the occasional lavish big-budget production that makes play for the mainstream. They mostly fail to break out of their niche of conservative Christian cinema and are destined to be missed by the majority of the wider world. I thought it might be interesting to dive into a specific segment of this niche to explore how these religious movies cover a particular topic. In this case, a woman's right to choose whether or not she wants to end a pregnancy. I wanted to focus on movies that present like traditional scripted fiction because the documentaries on this subject seem a lot more tedious and not nearly as entertaining. It turns out I still got an earful of bad anti-abortion arguments, but it was a lot more fun hearing them come out of a frumpy old dude pretending to be God. While I watched many of these movies, I decided to focus on several specific ones, and I broke them down into 3 categories. There are the ones based on true events, the ones driven by writer, director, actor, auteurs, and a third group that I can only describe as unhinged nonsense. I'm sure there will be other movies that fit outside these 3 categories, but for the purposes of this video, we're going to stick to ones that fit into these 3 categories. Roe v. Wade is not the first movie to go by that name, but having come out in 2020, it is the most recent. The production for this movie has an interesting background as it was plagued with financing challenges, staff working on the movie walking off set, and general bad press covering it. It came out at a time when the real-world Roe v. Wade Supreme Court decision was facing the threat of being struck down, something that would eventually happen. Written and directed by Nick Loeb and Kathy Allen, and starring Nick Loeb and a cadre of conservative celebrities and political pundits, this movie is mystifyingly bad. I'm actually at a slight loss of how to describe what a mess this movie was because it was so muddled. The movie claims to tell the story of the Roe v. Wade Supreme Court case that would eventually safeguard the right for people to have an abortion. The central character is ostensibly Bernard Nathanson, a doctor who advocated for and then against the pro-choice movement. He's played by Loeb.
What am I gonna do, Bernie?
Honey, it's we, and we're in this together, okay?
Nathan is the narrator for this movie, and wow, there is a lot of narration in here. One of its most frequently used stylistic quirks is to stop the movie mid-scene so the narrator can explain what's going on. The movie has to do this even when it's using this really clumsy dialogue that's filled with exposition, and it happens dozens of times. It's like the movie is aware it's such a mess that it needs to explain what's happening in every scene and how they all fit together.
I was, raped.
Norma may have been suicidal, but she admitted years later she lied about being raped.
There were times when I felt like I was watching a YouTube video where someone is summarizing a very poorly put together movie, which is something I have to do right now. We follow Nathanson for the first quarter of the movie as he interacts with a variety of important players, like Lauren Slater, played by Jamie Kennedy, and Mildred Faye Jefferson, played by Stacey Dash. The movie feels like it's running through every figure tied to this story, and none of them feel terribly important to these events. They're all making their own tiny little contributions, but no one ever feels like a major force or driving factor in this movie. That might make it more historically accurate, I guess, but it makes for a movie that feels as though it's constantly jumping from one storyline to another. And there are some characters who are included that seem completely superfluous, such as Robert Byrne, played by Joey Lawrence. He only seems to be there so he can lecture at the audience, which is why there are multiple scenes of him lecturing a classroom.
Somebody read me the constitutional amendment that states that we have the right to kill an unborn child.
Sir, it was just voted 7-2.
Justices replace the framers' choices for personal predilections.
The plot presents a version of history that's foreign to most history books, and one that weaves together elaborate conspiracy theories where activists are meeting in back rooms hatching plans to work together to broker influence, increase their power, and fight for the right for an abortion because they think it's going to make them really rich. At one point, we see them sing a song about how rich they're going to become because of all the abortions they're going to perform.
There's a fortune in abortion. It's a gold mine in the sex line.
Nathanson claimed in his book that they really sang this song, but hearing this out loud makes it sound like they had no idea how these lyrics were supposed to be sung. It's also incredibly weird to think that they have a special song about how they're going to get rich off of abortion. At the end of the movie, there's a text scrawl pointing out that Planned Parenthood made $1.6 billion aside from the fact that not all that money comes from abortion services, it also doesn't acknowledge that the number isn't a profit. This is just Planned Parenthood's revenue. The vast majority of that money is used to cover expenses because Planned Parenthood is a nonprofit organization. I pulled up some more recent numbers for the organization from 2023, and it shows that revenue has actually gone up, but that roughly $2 billion goes back to paying for the costs of running their operations. This is a really common talking point in a lot of these movies about how this is a very big business and people are getting rich, but clearly it's not Planned Parenthood, which is almost always the organization that's highlighted. Norma McCorvey, who would later go under the name Jane Roe, is presented with some sympathy in this movie as an unwitting pawn of the pro-choice group. In 1995, McCorvey had very publicly come out against abortion and converting to Christianity, which I think explains why this movie tries to present her as a victim and ally in their fight. What at first seemed like a major coup for the anti-abortion side would be later revealed as a complete fraud, as shortly before her death, McCorvey recorded an interview explaining that she had only changed her tune for money.
I took their money and they put me out in front of the cameras and told me what to say.
This was confirmed by one of the evangelical pastors who worked with her, Robert Schenck, who said that McCorvey was paid, adjusted for inflation, as much as $500,000 for her appearances. The documentary where all of this came out, aka Jane Roe, premiered several months before the Roe v. Wade movie was released. Though I'm sure it would have been very difficult to reshoot or edit out certain parts of this movie to reflect this new information, it is interesting to see that McCorvey is presented as an earnest anti-abortion voice speaking her conscience, when really she was just someone who was looking for a paycheck. What really emphasizes the type of movie this is and who it's intended for are all the cameos by conservative figures who have no business doing any acting on screen. There's Milo Yiannopoulos playing an abortion doctor, Mike Lindell playing a reporter, Roger Stone also playing a reporter, and Tommy Lahren playing the daughter of one of the justices of the Supreme Court. The movie ends with Nathanson watching an abortion on newly developed ultrasound technology. Seeing that apparently changed his heart. He becomes anti-abortion and converts to Christianity. Put a pin in this origin story for Nathanson because we're going to be coming back to it a bit later in a different movie. The drama behind the scenes of this movie is far more interesting than the slog that is Roe v. Wade. The details of this movie were kept secret from actors and crew working on it, something that became a necessity when the truth led to many of them abruptly leaving. The reason Nick Loeb and Kathy Allen had to direct the movie is because on the first day, the movie's original director and first assistant director quit the production. Some of the people who left the production decided to go public with their reasons why, and one location manager shared the text of what he wrote with The Hollywood Reporter. It reads, "I have been doing research on the movie trying to figure out who is producing and what the gist of the story is, and I finally found it. And so I am withdrawing from this project. I am a staunch pro-abortion feminist activist, and I will not be party to such horrible propaganda." The article also includes a weird quote from Loeb that makes it sound as though some of his personal life led to this movie being made. It reads, "But even without the news, Roe v. Wade is one of the most controversial political decisions in history. It divides us and makes us uncomfortable," says Loeb, adding that his own battle with Sofia Vergara over access to embryos they created has informed the film. "I have my own pro-life issue going on with my fight over embryos, but no one has really told the whole truth about Roe v. Wade in a film." It's well known that Loeb had a relationship with Sofia Vergara, and apparently they had created some frozen embryos, and Loeb pitched a legal battle because he believed he had a right to them after they split. Lies told to the crew members include not informing them of the graphic imagery that would be included in the movie, and there were cast members that had parts of the scripts hidden from them. The fact that the movie is such a narrative mess likely reflects the amateur nature of the production. One crew member described an embarrassing moment where Kathy Allen, who was the co-director, revealed her inexperience. This is a quote taken from a Daily Beast article. "There was a moment where Joey Lawrence was trying to do a scene and Kathy said to him, 'Now make a face like this.' And he called her out and said, 'That's not what a director does. You tell me what I'm feeling and where I'm coming from. You don't just say to make a face.' A lot of actors are fed up with it because it's amateur hour." The movie is executive produced by Avita King, niece of Martin Luther King Jr., and she appeared in a promotional video for the movie on the crowdfunding platform Freestarter, which explains why this movie has so many producers listed on its opening credits. The final fundraising tally for this movie was, based on the records I could find, about $100,000. What Roe v. Wade the movie ultimately represents is a culmination of the right-wing smear campaign against this legal ruling, distorting history and science to fit a political agenda, That a movie like this, supported by readings of all those things, can exist so seamlessly in the conservative vision of reality is damning in how much work has been done to create this artificial reality. Gosnell, the trial of America's biggest serial killer, is about the real-world story of Kermit Gosnell, who was found guilty of having murdered 3 children and also found guilty of involuntary manslaughter of a patient who was getting an abortion. Just to be clear up front, regardless of what side you're on regarding abortion, it's widely agreed that this man was monstrous. The murders for which he was found guilty of were not standard abortions, and they took place after completed deliveries. In addition to the murder charges, there were a number of other laws he violated, and all kinds of infractions against standard abortion procedures, such as his clinic being an unsanitary mess, his staff having no medical training, using unclean instruments that led to several of his patients being infected with STDs, and just outright abuse of several of his patients. This was a man who committed many crimes. After this case was made public, it was immediately weaponized by the anti-choice crowd. And based on the subtitle of this movie, it's pretty obvious that this is part of that weaponization. This movie used a crowdfunding campaign on Indiegogo where it raised just under $2.4 million. Here's a clip from the crowdfunding campaign about where that money was going.
With your help, we're going to hire the best screenwriter, director, and actors to make sure that the story of Kermit Gosnell gets into every home in America.
The names attached to this movie were Nick Searcy to direct, who you might recognize from the TV show Justified, or if you watch this channel regularly, that awful Gina Carano movie Terror on the Prairie. He also plays Gosnell's lawyer, Mike Cohen. The movie's screenplay was written by Andrew Klavan, who you might recognize as the old guy on the Daily Wire no one really talks about, though he's written a few books and screenplays over the years, which I think is how he got this job. And the movie's lead is Dean Cain as Detective James Wood. This is apparently a real guy, by the way, not a reference to actor James Woods. Lead is a bit of a stretch, though, as the Detective Wood character didn't really seem like the protagonist in the movie, at least not after the first 30 minutes. To me, the more fitting lead was Assistant District Attorney Lexi McGuire, played by Sarah Jane Morris, a mother of 5 who prosecutes the case and who serves as the focal point for about 2/3 of the movie. Though I guess she doesn't have the raw star power of a guy who was on a Superman show 20 years ago. The movie's agenda is very clear, even though it constantly has characters telling us that this case isn't about abortion.
All right, stop right there. This is not a case about abortion.
This is not a case about abortion.
This is not a case about abortion.
It's done so frequently that it makes me think this movie is about abortion. There are moments that are far less subtle that hammer that point home. For instance, here's Dean Cain and his partner discovering severed baby feet in jars at Gosnell's office. That's a real thing that happened, by the way.
I mean, is this normal? I don't know. I've never been in an abortion clinic before.
And then the findings are later reported.
Bodies? What do you mean? Fetuses?
Well, I mean, they look like babies to me.
This doctor, who is presented as an expert witness on how to safely run an abortion clinic, is grilled so badly that it feels like she's the one on trial.
So before, when you said that you'd never cut the neck of a fetus...
I was referring to a live birth.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I get it now.
This scene lasts several minutes, and it's going out of its way to equate Gosnell with other providers of abortion, something that is absolutely not true. And it's kind of interesting that Gosnell's lawyer, who is very much a villain in this movie, is suddenly presented as someone who's talking some sense. Before this movie was produced, the story of Kermit Gosnell was taken up by anti-choice activists as typical of abortion providers, when he was truly a unique case. Carol Jaffe, a professor in the Bixby Center for Global Reproductive Health at the University of California, San Francisco, went into great detail about what can be learned from this legal case in her book, Dispatches from the Abortion Wars. She highlighted how Gosnell was able to operate because he preyed specifically on women from marginalized communities who didn't have access to better care. He undercut prices from other clinics by at least $1,000, and he ignored laws regarding post-viability in his state. Jaffe writes in her book, "In a horrible, unfair, vicious cycle, the poorest women often take time to raise the funds for an abortion, and then find themselves past the cutoff for procedures available early on, and facing a higher cost for an abortion. When women in these situations realize that they neither have the funds to pay for a later procedure and or can't find a reputable provider that will perform the procedures after 24 weeks, they end up at places like Women's Medical Society." Women's Medical Society was Gosnell's clinic. A blog post by Jeffrey Deeney, a social worker in Philadelphia, also highlights how people in the Philadelphia neighborhood Gosnell operated in had access to a much higher quality health center, but it didn't provide abortions. And poor people on Medicaid wouldn't be able to pay for them anyway. Dini also highlights that more than a failure to access, this is also a failure of government oversight. In the section of the grand jury report titled, "How did this go on so long?" the jury outlines in great detail the multiple levels of oversight failure that allowed Gosnell to murder viable babies and endanger women in plain sight of the medical and regulatory communities for years. Failure ran across all levels of both state and local agencies. The PA Department of Health, Department of State, Philadelphia Department of Health, and other local doctors all share a place in the intersecting lattice of complicity that allowed Gosnell's illegal activities to continue unabated. Another thing the movie makes much hay of is that the Gosnell story was supposedly ignored by mainstream media. Here are the prosecutors arriving at the courthouse for the first day of trial in the movie.
I'll be damned.
Of course, the movie can't get it out of its own way when it shows Gosnell being interviewed by local news a few minutes later. So I guess the news was covering it. Though a big plot point in this movie is that a random blogger is shown spreading it on social media, finally convincing the traditional media to cover the story. This supposed media blackout was a central point in the movie and even mentioned in its crowdfunding video.
Too often we complain about the mainstream media not reporting the news and throw stuff at our TV sets. Now you can do something about it.
This is, quite simply, revisionist history. Here's an op-ed from Jill Filipovich writing for Al Jazeera highlighting the media coverage of this story. Feminist and pro-choice writers covered Gosnell extensively when the story first broke in 2010 and in 2011 when the grand jury report detailing Gosnell's alleged crimes was filed. Coverage came from Katha Pollitt in The Nation, Amanda Marcotte in Slate, Kate Harding in Salon, Margaret Harmon and Erin Gloria Ryan in Jezebel, Akiba Solomon in Color Lines, Lori Adelman in NBC's The Griot, Michelle Goldberg in The Daily Beast, and dozens of other pieces in smaller publications and on blogs, including yours truly. We all condemned him in strong terms, using phrases like horror show, house of horrors, and butcher, and detailed the accusations. The mainstream media also covered the case. CNN, Time, The New York Times, NPR, CBS, The Washington Post, and dozens of other outlets all featured the charges against Gosnell in early 2011. Once a verdict is handed down, there is little doubt the mainstream publications will again dedicate stories and segments to the case. And she was right in her prediction. The verdict was widely reported on by mainstream outlets. The photo of empty benches in the courtroom, which was presented in the movie, doesn't erase the existence of media coverage like the examples highlighted. The legacy of the Gosnell case can't be understated, though, as before Roe v. Wade was overturned, his story was used to limit the access people had to abortion. Here's an article from The Independent by Rachel Sharp. By the time Gosnell was convicted in May 2013, stricter abortion laws had already been rolled out in several states, with Arkansas banning most abortions after 12 weeks and North Dakota after 6. Tougher laws were also making their way through the legislatures of other states, including North Carolina, Texas, Wisconsin, and Ohio. What Gosnell's case had done was give the anti-abortion movement credibility in its efforts to demonize abortion doctors, clinics, and ultimately abortion rights altogether, says Mary Ziegler, UC Davis Martin Luther King Jr. professor of law and an expert in the politics of reproduction and healthcare in the U.S. These regulations were very much in the tradition of caring less for the health of people and more about cutting off access to medical care. This goes back a few decades, specifically the 1992 Supreme Court ruling Planned Parenthood v. Casey, and then later the case Gonzalez versus Carhart, which had a powerful impact on abortion rights. The laws that follow these rulings, targeted restrictions on abortion providers, or TRAP laws, were onerous regulations designed to restrict access to abortion under the guise of providing safety to women. Many of these laws led to closures of clinics that offered abortion access across the United States. The irony of the Gosnell case is that it's a story that everyone agrees was horrific and should not have been allowed to happen, but it was weaponized in a way that would only make things worse. While the anti-choice crowd is trying to present it as poor regulation, requiring stricter laws to limit access, the problem isn't that laws were too loose, but rather they weren't being enforced. Numerous complaints were made about Gosnell for years, but the government did nothing to intervene. By restricting access further rather than making existing access safer, it ironically creates the opportunity for more illegal operations like Gosnell's, or potentially even more dangerous options. This movie had a limited theatrical release, making roughly $3.7 million, so it appears to have been a minor success in that it earned back more than its budget, though it was hardly a smash hit. Unplanned is probably one of the most popular anti-choice movies, but for the unfamiliar, it's based on a book of the same name that alleges to tell the story of Abby Johnson, played by Ashley Bratcher, a former clinic director for Planned Parenthood who turned into an anti-abortion activist. The movie details her 8 years with Planned Parenthood, including many gruesome scenes of bloody abortions and traumatic encounters with a corporation obsessed with making money before Abby is finally convinced of the evil of abortion when she sees one performed using an ultrasound.
Beam me up, Scotty.
I should mention right off the bat that many doctors have described this movie's portrayal of the procedure as incorrect or grossly exaggerated. Here's one response from a HuffPost article. In reality, serious complications during abortion are rare and occur less frequently than during childbirth. In 2013, a total of 664,435 abortions were reported to the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Only 4 women died as a result of complications that year. Abortion is one of the safest outpatient procedures that you can have in the U.S. Jen Villavinciano, an OBGYN and abortion provider in Michigan, said, "You are less likely to have a complication than a colonoscopy or a wisdom tooth extraction." The movie seems to relish in these kinds of shocking scenes. Early in the movie, we find out Abby has had 2 abortions, with the second coming from taking a pill, and the depiction of this is very gruesome. At one point, we see Abby heaping handfuls of gunk into the toilet and flushing it down. This is an example of how the movie loves to wallow in these shocking scenes of gore. And after this deeply traumatic experience, Abby decides to become a recruiter for Planned Parenthood.
My cause became my career, despite the disapproval of virtually everyone in my life.
This is a pretty standard plot twist in the movie. Abby experiences or witnesses something horrific and traumatic related to abortion, and then she continues on as a pro-choice advocate. It's a wonder why she even continues, since everyone around her, in her family and her husband, they all seem to sort of low-key disapprove of everything she's doing. The only positive reinforcement we see for Abby comes from her coworkers and boss. Her boss in particular sees potential in Abby. In this scene, Abby's boss has taken her to the products of a conception room, which is jokingly called the Pieces of Children room by one of the characters.
Do you know what's happened with every other person who's come in here and seen one of these? The first thing they do, they cry. But not you. That's how I know you're the one.
Planned Parenthood, as presented in this movie, is a big nefarious corporation that you would expect to be run by Lex Luthor or some comic book villain.
You know those guys who try to sell you timeshares in places you never even heard of? They had nothing on me.
Each of your clinics are being assigned growth targets to double last year's totals on elective terminations.
And then there's this ridiculous comparison to fast food.
Fast food outlets look to break even on the hamburgers they sell. That's all they do, is break even. Do you know how they make their money?
No.
On the French fries and the soda, the low-cost, high-margin items.
Cheryl, I'm sorry, but I don't understand.
Abortion is our fries and soda.
I mentioned this a little earlier, but it bears repeating. Planned Parenthood is a non-profit. This movie tries to twist itself into a knot and explain where all that money is going. And Amy's boss says stuff like this.
It pays for your matching 401k, your 4 weeks vacation, your ample sick time. Abortion is what pays for all of it.
Honestly, it makes her sound a lot less villainous when we find out this money is being used to give employees 401ks and sick days. We should all be so grateful that bosses are fighting so that their workers will have better benefits. The supposed abortion industry criticism in this movie is interesting to me because it's basically an appropriation of criticisms typically used by the left about the medical care industry more broadly. From for-profit hospitals to pharmaceutical companies, the profit motive has made getting medical care in the US and many other countries far more difficult and restrictive. What the movie is making is not an argument against abortion, it's an argument for publicly funding or public ownership of the healthcare system. To narrow focus on a single procedure is to effectively obfuscate this much more valid and interesting critique, one that affects anyone who ever has to receive healthcare. Another strange thing in this movie that stuck out to me was how protesters were presented. In one rare instance, there was this one guy being a total dick.
And all this because you couldn't keep your legs closed.
But after that, pretty much every protester in the movie is presented as perfectly pleasant.
Your little baby already has a beating heart, and she loves you with all of it.
I think this presentation of protesters is best explained by Abby's real-life story, where upon leaving Planned Parenthood, she entered the embrace of the same group that was protesting the location she worked at. And I think it's here where the movie's true story can be better understood. Abby Johnson had become a prominent figure in the anti-choice movement well before the release of this movie. Obviously, a former director of Planned Parenthood is a major win for the anti-choice side. But because of her high profile, her story has come under a lot of scrutiny, and a lot of it, including what was depicted in the movie, doesn't add up. One particularly compelling piece was published in the Texas Observer, which includes an interview with Abby Johnson. When Abby Johnson is confronted about money troubles leading her to working with the anti-abortion group, she says it's untrue. The article reads, "It's laughable," she said. "I mean, literally all that about bankruptcy makes me laugh. There's no truth in it whatsoever. Anyway," she added, "the coalition's not paying me a dime to be here. I'm just a volunteer." In that case, I asked, "How are you making rent?" "Speaking gigs," she said. "I went to New York a couple times, and I went to Brenham, Texas. The bulk of all that is going to be starting up in January, though." The article also includes an interview with Laura Kaminksak, who is described as Johnson's best friend in 2005. She also worked at Planned Parenthood, albeit at another location, and so the two frequently spoke about their jobs. Kaminksak contradicts huge swaths of Johnson's story and says the reason Johnson quit Planned Parenthood is because of tension at work after she was disciplined, alongside Kaminksak for mocking another employee in company emails. Johnson insists that it was the ultrasound abortion she witnessed that convinced her abortion was wrong, but her friend contradicted that too. "I talked to her right after she saw that abortion," Kaminksak said. "She was super excited about it. She said that it seemed a lot more humane than the normal procedure, like the patient was in a lot less pain." "She wasn't bothered at all?" "I mean, I asked her that," Kaminksak said. "She said no. And I asked her if people at the clinic were going to be okay with it, and she said, well, if we hire this doctor and this is how he does things, I guess they're going to have to be." An article in Texas Monthly similarly cast doubt when it found a Facebook post Johnson had made after quitting, never once mentioning some kind of moral dilemma. It read, "All right, here's the deal. I have been doing the work of 2 full-time people for 2 years. Then, after I had been working my whole big butt off for them and prioritizing that company over my family, my friends, and pretty much everything else in my life, they have the nerve to tell me that my job performance is slipping. What? That is crazy. Anyone that knows me knows how committed I was to that job. They obviously do not value me at all, so I'm out and I feel really great about it." The story of the abortion she supposedly witnessed doesn't appear to match any records that have been uncovered by journalists. The Texas Monthly article reads, "At my request, the staff at the Bryan Clinic examined patient records from September 26th, the day Johnson claims to have had her conversion experience, and spoke with a physician who performed abortions on that date. According to Planned Parenthood, there is no record of an ultrasound-guided abortion performed on September 26th. The physician on duty told the organization that he did not use an ultrasound that day, nor did Johnson assist on any abortion procedure. Planned Parenthood can assure you that no abortion patients underwent an ultrasound-guided abortion on September 26th, said a spokesperson. It is difficult to imagine that Johnson simply got the date wrong. September 12th was the only other day that month that the clinic performed surgical abortions." Johnson did respond to this specific article, claiming that the records the journalist saw were possibly falsified by Planned Parenthood, but she was unable to provide any contradictory evidence. Johnson claimed that there was a form she filled out that the state currently possesses that would prove her right. The problem is that the journalist in this article actually asked her about that form, and at the time she had said she had never filled out one of those forms before, something he pointed out in his response to her response. Through various contradictions she's made, it appears that Abby Johnson has at many times lied about her experiences. What struck me about the scene where Abby views the ultrasound-assisted abortion and the supposed real-life event that inspired it is that it's incredibly similar to what supposedly happened to Bernard Nathanson. He had performed numerous abortions, but suddenly this ultrasound experience was enough to convince him otherwise. This story, by the way, is quite popular in the anti-choice crowds because Nathanson would go on to produce the documentary The Silent Scream, which is filled with lots of misinformation, but also uses ultrasounds to try and make its case. While I was researching this, I tried to get a sense of whether or not Abby Johnson knew anything about Bernard Nathanson, and the closest thing I could find was a post on her blog she made shortly after Nathanson passed in 2011. She wrote, "The week I left Planned Parenthood, two things happened. I watched Silent Scream for the first time and read my first pro-life book, The Hand of God by Dr. Nathanson. I don't think that was coincidence." Here, I think she's saying that she's being guided by some divine presence, but to me it seems like a heck of a coincidence that the first book she read, whose conversion to the anti-choice movement mirrors her so similarly. It may not even be that she's plagiarizing him, it could simply be that after reading his work and watching his movie, she is now reinterpreting her own memories of having watched an ultrasound abortion in the past. A few final notes I want to make about this movie is that it was financed in part by Mike Lindell, so he gets a goofy cameo towards the end.
Ready? Are you kidding? I've been waiting for this my whole life.
The movie also faced some genuine barriers to getting covered in the media, as it had a well-deserved R rating considering all the violence and gore, and many outlets simply refused to run ads for it. But luckily for this movie, it was championed by right-wing politicians, commentators, and influencers, which helped propel it to a box office return of over $20 million, earning the movie a nice profit off its budget of $6 million. A pretty impressive return for a movie that dared take on one of the most powerful organizations on the planet.
You've managed to make an enemy of one of the most powerful organizations on the planet.
I wanted to end this section on this quote because it captures so perfectly what makes these movies based on true events so utterly silly. They need to turn Planned Parenthood into this evil corporation because, at a narrative level, it's something that can easily be understood. We all grew up watching TV shows and movies where evil corporations destroyed the planet or took advantage of people. It's an easy archetype to understand. And our heroes are often underdogs, brave whistleblowers, or humble civil servants, completely ignoring the massive political project that has been going on for decades to take away the right for someone to choose to have an abortion. Even when a true villain is found, he needs to be tied up directly to this greater myth of abortion providers because it helps sell the mythology of the big nefarious machine that is being fought against. These are how these classic tropes are being deployed, using the familiar language of movies to reshape history to fashion this anti-choice narrative. The next two movies I want to talk about are very similar and dissimilar to one another. They're very clearly the product of a single driving force where one person writes, directs, and stars in their respective movie, but the outcomes are drastically different. Alison's Choice is by Bruce Marchiano, and as the title suggests, it's about a girl named Alison struggling with the choice of whether or not she should get an abortion. The movie takes place almost entirely at a clinic as Alison talks to a variety of characters, but probably most notable is the janitor, played by Marchiano. We get several not-so-subtle hints that this guy is more than just a janitor, like this one where Alison is thanking him for fixing her phone.
Thank you, Jesus. Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't offend you today.
No, I hear it all the time.
Yeah, the janitor is God. The movie is kind enough not to insult our intelligence for too long, as his identity is revealed a little over 15 minutes into the movie.
I'm not a ghost. I'm certainly no angel. I'm definitely not. Kind of leaves only one option.
The rest of this movie is pretty much just God trying to convince Alison not to get an abortion.
I want you to go away.
I can't go away. I'm God.
A few other characters do show up to offer different perspectives to Alison, but unsurprisingly, these cutouts don't do much more than make bad arguments or act like caricatures.
Or some whining child who will frankly one day bleed you dry and then leave you like everyone else. Except for my 3 kitties, Frank, Fluffy, and Tubbs. I admit, my kitties are my life.
Unlike a lot of the other movies I mentioned in this video, Alison's Choice actually features several non-white characters, but this is one of those times I'm not sure representation was a good idea.
Look, woman, I don't care about no private nothing, all right? You got my woman and my baby in there. Now, either they coming out or the D-man coming in.
You remember, Lucretia loves you. You stick that in your little love language. Bye-bye, boo. See you at my baby shower.
But racial representation isn't the only dropped ball in this movie. There's also this moment where the secretary at the clinic offers some compassion by Alison by more or less telling her to stop being a slut.
In my day, a girl did her best to keep her drawers on because she knew there was a high price to pay if she took them off. There are a lot of beautiful sons and daughters alive because of it.
There's not a lot to analyze in this movie because it's pretty much wearing its heart on its sleeve here and just hitting you over the head with its message. This is Alison struggling with her faith by literally having an argument with God. It could be an interesting premise for a movie, but what we have is God clearly being on the right, trying to convince Alison, who just, for various reasons, refuses to hear reason. It comes off less like a debate and more like a lecture. You might suspect you know where all of this is going and what Alison's choice will be, but oddly enough, we never get there. The movie ends with her about to make her choice, and then suddenly we flash forward and see God spending another day at the abortion clinic. So we don't really know what Alison decided. For a movie so completely lacking in subtlety, it's a very strange decision to leave this conclusion so vague. I imagine they thought this would be a very provocative ending, getting people to think about things, but the movie doesn't really present a balanced debate. It simply hits you over the head with some religion. Alison's choice is almost the perfect representation of a movie that could have been a pamphlet. It's not thought-provoking and it's certainly not entertaining. It simply exists to affirm a belief. But what I think best explains the failings of this movie is comparing it to another movie that more or less is telling the same story, but instead driven by a filmmaker with a far more interesting artistic vision. Bella, written, directed, and starring Alejandro Gomez Monteverde, caught me completely off guard because I genuinely like this movie. One of the first bold and visionary choices made in this movie is that the main character, played by the director, is named Jose, a stunning masterstroke of creativity. But I swear, it wasn't just the character's name that got to me here. Jose, who works as a chef at his brother's restaurant, finds out one of the servers, Nina, played by Tammy Blanchard, is pregnant. He decides to take off with her after his obnoxious brother Manny fires her.
Manny, please, give me another chance. I promise I'll make everything good. How could you be so...
Jose is filled with regret from past events in his life that led to a young girl's death. So he's drawn to Nina, seeing in her a chance for his own redemption. He spends the day with her and shares the story of his life, and she shares her story. Although at first Nina is committed to ending the pregnancy, her time with Jose has her reconsidering that decision, not through some cheesy love story, the two of them never get together, but by being provided a positive vision of a world where she can give birth and provide both her and her child with a fulfilling life. This movie was clearly made with a lot of talent and a strong sense of style. And perhaps I'm just being generous compared to all the other anti-choice movies I watched, but this one felt like a real movie. What undergirds this movie is not a reflexive emphasis on what the moral choice is, as dictated by a holy book, but rather the personal stories of the characters and their unique challenges. Nina is a young woman struggling to build a life for herself, and she's given the space to be more than a confused girl, and instead becomes a character longing for a home she never got to have when she was younger, and she's afraid of bringing a child into a world just like the one she grew up in.
I can't have this baby and watch it suffer with me.
Jose is looking for a chance to pull himself out of the depression he's been feeling for years. The fact that they don't fall in love is a very tasteful bit of nuance, too. There are two characters whose lives have intersected in an unusual way, and aside from being coworkers, there's nothing here to suggest that there's anything more than a friendship between them. One of the things that annoys me so frequently in these anti-choice movies is that they are so utterly focused on preventing an abortion from happening that the rest of the future baby's life is left to fate. Once the choice is made, many of these movies assume God will provide for the rest. But in Bella, when Jose brings Nina to his family's home, it's establishing that these choices aren't just about doing good in the moment, but trying to show someone that there are people who will safeguard the consequences for that choice in the future, showing Nina that her child will have a home and so will she.
Esta es su casa.
What this movie is presenting is not demanding women make a certain choice or another, but rather presenting the idea that if you truly want people to make different choices, you have to present them with an environment where that choice can be more easily made. It understands that choices are often made not through a person's individual moral character, as informed by a holy text, but rather the material reality we live in. If someone chooses to have an abortion out of economic desperation, the solution isn't to throw the Bible at them. The solution is to ease that economic hardship. This is a far more compelling argument. But just to be clear, this Jose, not the one in the movie, is certainly pro-choice. And the reasons for why they make that decision are entirely their own. I'm just saying that this movie is presenting a far more compelling arguments than any of the other ones I've talked about. And there is definitely room for criticism of this movie. For instance, you might have noticed that Jose looks an awful lot like Jesus in this pretty on-the-nose depiction. Luckily, the character isn't some physical embodiment of the divine. Rather, he's presenting a version of living in the world that is acting Christ-like, rather than him just being a manifestation of the Holy Spirit. The choice to focus on Jose as much as it does is a bit odd, of course. He is the main character in what is a story that is also very much about Nina's pregnancy. As a character, Nina is given the chance to be well-developed and a person in her own right, but this choice to focus on Jose, I think, leaves out a lot of important parts about whether or not Nina should carry this child to term. For an example, one thing this movie misses is that the decision to end a pregnancy isn't just about the challenges of raising a child after the delivery, but also the physical strain it places on someone as they carry a pregnancy to term. Had this been more of Nina's story, it might have grappled with that more directly, but by focusing on Jose's story of redemption, I think it misses something very important that also goes into the decision a person has to make. In the movie, Jose helps Nina get a new job as a server, but how does she handle that job when she's 8 months pregnant? The movie doesn't really address that. It just subtly implies that Jose will take care of everything that goes wrong. As I said, this movie didn't change my position on being pro-choice, but it was probably the most earnest of the movies I watched in trying to present an alternative. One that, instead of throwing a Bible at someone, dared to wonder what it would mean to create space in society for an eventual child that doesn't have a space in their mother's life, and what sort of things people would need to do to make that happen. It's not a coincidence that Jose needs his entire family to back him up on this, because this isn't the decision one man can make. It's a decision an entire community would need to make. Going back to Alison's choice, we can see that these two movies are more or less telling the same story. A young pregnant woman is confronted by a man representing the divine to convince her to keep her pregnancy. In one case, we get a very clumsy and heavy-handed stand-in for God. In the other, we get this more metaphorical message where, in the character of Jose, we get someone who obviously represents a kind of Christian charity, but is still very much centered in the real-world requirements of what that charity would actually look like. There are lots of other points of comparison that highlight the disparity between these two movies. For instance, Alison, for all we know, barely exists as a character outside of her time at the abortion clinic. Nina has a real past that informs her life and decisions in the present. When these characters are given visions of what their futures might be, Alison has to look at this weird CG fetus and these supernatural visions of the future, whereas Nina is presented with the very real vision of a loving family and a happy home, one that she might see her own child be a part of. The characters in Alison's choice act like cartoons at best and billboards for talking points at worst. In Bella, even minor characters feel alive, and New York City feels like a real place. Jose's family is charming and endearing, and then there's this revelation that his brother Manny was adopted, and you can understand why Jose specifically and his family would be so keen to go through the adoption process again. Alison's Choice is a movie telling us what to think right from the get-go, but Bella reveals that this choice isn't so easy, and that it's not simply a question of moral character, but a desire to make the world a better place. It shouldn't be a surprise that Alison's Choice was actually the product of a ministry, although ironically it feels completely soulless. Bella, on the other hand, was created to really tackle a question. It debuted at the Toronto International Film Festival in 2006 and won the People's Choice Award. And it's not surprising why. It's genuinely endearing. If the director's name, Montverde, sounds familiar, it's because he would go on to direct The Sound of Freedom, a movie about sex trafficking that caused a stir in 2023 when it became part of a right-wing word-of-mouth campaign that saw it earn over $250 million at the box office. I'm honestly not interested in litigating that movie, and I actually haven't seen it, but it does suggest that Montverde is leaning into the religious sensibilities that seem very present in Bella. And while I certainly can't endorse this guy or everything he does, I'm reflexively suspicious of anyone who works with Angel Studios, so I feel like I should at least mention that. Still, even with that side eye I have directed towards him, I can't deny that as a filmmaker, he is talented. For this next movie, I genuinely felt a shiver up my spine when I read its title. It's called Loving the Bad Man. And yeah, your first guess about the plot for this one is probably pretty close. My first guess was that I assumed it was a story about a woman in an abusive relationship who decides to stay when she finds out she's pregnant, and she changes her boyfriend through the power of religion. It turns out it's worse than that. Directed and written by Peter Engert, with writing credits also going to Giovanni Igneri and Wes Halula, this is the story of Julie, played by Christine Kelly. She's your typical Christian girl who wears a Got Jesus tag at work and reads the Bible on her break. When she's driving home, naturally, singing about God, she gets a flat tire and is helped by a guy named Mike, played by Arturo Rossi. Mike is something of a bad boy, having recently beat up his boss at work, and he is very drunk. After he helps repair Julie's car, she offers him some money and he's offended by this, so he sexually assaults her. Mike is arrested and Julie later finds out she's pregnant. And we have what is probably the most realistic scene in the movie when Julie's very Christian family, that's absolutely anti-abortion, decide maybe they can make an exception in this case.
You know how we all feel about abortion. We're against it. But not in cases like this, and it's still early enough. God would understand.
Julie, of course, decides she's keeping the pregnancy. I also need to point out one weird thing that happens in this scene. Julie's coworker Cole shows up. Although they work together, she's only spoken to him one time in an earlier scene when he awkwardly asks her out, but was rejected. That also seems to be the first time they've ever spoken, as she didn't recognize him at all. And now this guy is suddenly showing up at her home because she hasn't been to work in a while. It gives off real stalker vibes. It's very creepy, but he's supposed to be a good Christian boy.
She's the kindest, most compassionate person I've ever met. I don't know what you guys are doing right, but she has a beautiful soul.
It's an example of this movie presenting plot points that just seem detached from reality, or at least never consider the perspective of what this must be like for a young woman. Julie gives birth to a boy, names him Arthur, and after reading the Bible, decides to visit Michael in jail because she's decided to forgive him. This, by the way, isn't even the half point in the movie, and it makes Julie seem unusually saintly. She's gotten over a traumatic event at a pace that is disturbingly rapid. Before getting to many of the other criticisms I have of this movie, though, I want to highlight the one interesting idea that is represented by Julie's decision. And the movie very explicitly describes it to us.
It's easy to say you forgive someone. It's not that tough to actually forgive them when that's what everybody thinks you should do.
The idea of forgiving someone in the face of social pressure not to is a genuinely interesting concept. And Julie struggling with that pressure could be an interesting story. Problem is, she doesn't really struggle with it. She turns to that very quickly. She helpfully explains that the reason she wants to forgive Michael is because God told her to.
God wants me to forgive Mike. I've been forgiven. I need to forgive. That's what this is about.
Especially considering the subject matter of this movie, it shouldn't be easy. Of all the things to forgive someone over, rape is an incredibly difficult subject to choose. And the whole thing reads like this was written by someone who's never once listened to a single person's story about what it's like to experience this and the lasting trauma that it has. You might be asking, if Julie made this journey less than halfway through the movie, what is it actually about? And it's Julie trying to convince Michael to allow her to visit and accept her forgiveness and to help him be a better person. Mike's prison story isn't interesting at all. The short version is that he gets embroiled in a conflict between rival gangs, and though he tries to stay out of it, the fact that his one friend in prison is connected to them pulls him into this conflict. I should highlight, one of the gangs are a group of skinheads led by Stephen Baldwin with the worst fake tattoos I've ever seen. Much like Julie, Mike is eventually saved via the power of the Bible.
Is your reward in heaven? In heaven.
So Mike does what anyone would do after reading the Bible and finding inner peace. He starts a prison riot. What's especially funny is that a few scenes later, Michael says this.
When I read this, I don't feel like hurting anybody anymore.
I'm not sure how you can go from finding religion, starting a prison riot, and then becoming a man of peace. The context here, by the way, is that Mike started a fight because he was upset that his friend was murdered, but it's very strange that after reading the Bible, his first move is to go for some vengeance. Though I guess maybe it makes perfect sense depending on which part you read. After starting the riot, Mike becomes a marked man, and the one skinhead that has no hair decides he's going after Julie and the baby, and the only way to stop them is for Michael to sacrifice himself. But before all of that happens, we have Mike finally taking accountability for his actions. He needs to finally apologize to the person he hurt the most in all of this.
I feel like somehow I took this girl away from her dad. I'm sorry for that.
Yes, he needed to apologize to Julie's father. Really shocking stuff. But that's not where the madness ends. Afterwards, Michael confronts the white gang because he needs to know that if he gives himself up and lets himself be killed, that his family will be safe. So he relies on the honor of gang leader Stephen Baldwin.
I think he was gonna hurt Julie and my son. You don't have to worry about that.
The 2 8s on Stephen Baldwin's head, which seem to move around from scene to scene, are a well-known Nazi symbol, along with many of the other tattoos on him. While the other gangs are generally shown in a better light than the white one, it's weird that at the end, our hero has to rely on a Nazi gang leader keeping his word to ensure Julie and the baby will stay safe. The movie ends with Julie reading a letter from Mike, who is aware of his impending death, and it's heavily implied that Julie will get together with that weird coworker who's kind of a stalker.
Why does God keep waking me up in the middle of the night telling me I need to pray for you?
The message of this movie seems to be learning how to give and accept forgiveness, but it never really makes a case for that. It just kicks the responsibility for all of that to the Bible and presumes there's some magical force that transforms people from bad to good, or it makes the good people even better. In this movie, forgiveness and change is as simple as reading a few passages from the Bible. We don't even get an interesting discussion on why these passages are so powerful, especially to Mike. Had he never heard of the Bible before? Did he not know forgiveness is a big part of Christianity? His friend in prison was offering him good advice on how to be there for your kid, but why does the Bible get all the credit for this transformation? The anti-choice component of this movie is a bit muted, but obviously still present. Julie never considers the choice she has, and the most difficult part of carrying the pregnancy to term is solved with her reading the Bible and learning to forgive. While I wouldn't judge someone's personal choice, in the real world, anyone's choice is entirely their own. In this movie, it all happens so easily. We spend so much more time with Mike, learning how to be a decent guy. Julie is just expected to get over it after one montage and the time it takes to have a baby. I don't think you can move on from a violent sexual assault forgiving your attacker so easily, or at least the movie would have been better had it shown her struggling a bit more. As you might have noticed from these clips, the production values for this movie are pretty bad, so I wanted to end on something a little more fun. One thing you can't really tell unless watching a clip is that the audio really lets everything down. For example, here's a man slamming his hand on the table. Now listen to the audio quality in this conversation.
Who do you think sleeps more in a day? Arthur or Joey?
Joey.
It's a bit baffling to think that this movie was made in 2010. I also checked a few reviews online that show even religious people seemed sour on this movie, probably because it tries and utterly fails to handle a topic that needs to be dealt with so much more carefully. You can probably get away with making a sloppy Christian movie about abortion if you don't try to work in a story about sexual assault into it. Horror is not a natural fit for an anti-choice movie. Although elements like gore and high tension are used in these movies, to delve all the way into horror seems a bit distasteful. Unfortunately, or perhaps luckily for us, the Life Zone dared to make this journey. The movie tells the story of 3 women who were on their way to get an abortion, but instead woke up in a room where they find out they'll be forced to carry their pregnancies to term, and to pass the time, over the next 7 months, they'll have to watch people debating abortion.
And then we'll have an opportunity to do something that no one really ever has. We'll have an abortion think tank for the next 7 months.
It seems strange for the villains to force these women to watch videos of people debating abortion, since they've effectively taken away their right to choose anyway. But I guess the assumption is that the pro-choice side is so weak that they would lose in any actual debate if someone took the time to watch them. But the subtext here I think is clear, that the whole debate around this is entirely performative, because one side would happily lock people in a room and get their way through force. Now you might think to yourself that I've misunderstood this movie, that it's very clear that the anti-choice side are the villains here, so maybe this is actually a pro-choice movie. Well, the ending for the movie makes it all perfectly clear what this movie's agenda is. But before getting there, I want to point out a few other interesting parts about this movie. For instance, it has some surprising cameos, such as Robert Loggia. He appears on a television screen because it seems like he couldn't be bothered to actually appear on set.
No, I'm not your judge, ladies. I am your jailer.
In an article from NJ.com, they spoke to Loggia at the movie's premiere. I didn't know what the finished product would be, he admitted. All of his scenes shot in Los Angeles, apart from the main production in Brooklyn. but it dealt with abortion and birth, and it leaves you very challenged to find the proper attitude toward abortion. Another similar cameo was Martin Kove, who appeared in a single scene shot somewhere completely separate from the set. The three women are being held hostage by an evil doctor, and Kove plays her ex-boyfriend, who dumped her because she had trouble getting pregnant.
I'm never coming back. Ever.
The doctor's side plot is kind of depressing. She spent her time focusing on her career, so when she wanted to have a kid, she had trouble conceiving because of her age. When her boyfriend leaves her for another woman, the doctor found out she was pregnant and then got an abortion. Her holding these women hostage is part of her penance. Most of the movie centers around the three women debating the doctor, or at least the two that disagree with the doctor. We find out one of the women is more conservative and immediately comes around to thinking she needs to carry the pregnancy to term. Seems a little mean that they would make her stay there for another 7 months, but that gets explained in the ending. Eventually, all three of the women go into labor towards the end of the movie, and they all deliver babies. Only one of them, the more liberal Stacy, isn't enjoying the bliss of motherhood. It's here we get the movie's final twist.
You're pregnant.
No, it can't be.
Those other two women, they don't exist. What really happened here is that Stacy died when she was getting an abortion, and now she's in hell, forced to experience the miracle of childbirth over and over.
Welcome to your eternity, Dr. Wise, Stacy. Prepare for another 9 months.
Oh, and the doctor who got an abortion is also in hell with her. The movie's writer and producer, Kenneth Del Vecchio, had a funny comment about the ending of the movie in that NJ.com article. It's like the Twilight Zone. Life, like pro-life zone, like the Twilight Zone. And if you've seen Twilight Zone episodes, it punches you in the face in the end, Del Vecchio added, though he was quick to note he still felt the film's presentation of the issues was balanced. I think the audience will walk away not knowing what the filmmaker's position is. It gives both sides of the coin. But the filmmaker is no more shy about promoting his political positions in the film than he is promoting his films on the campaign trail. Del Vecchio's campaign website clearly states his belief abortion is mass murder, but before encountering his position statements, visitors to www.kenforstate.com see a sidebar of trailers for his films, as well as a campaign commercial featuring some of his film stars, including pro-life actor Robert Loggia. Here's a clip of that campaign ad, by the way.
I've worked with Kenneth Del Vecchio on several movies. The man is honest.
Asked what prompted him to support Del Vecchio for state senate and why he is in a campaign commercial for the Republican candidate, a confused Loggia suddenly experienced a plot twist of his own. I don't know. I am? I imagine Del Vecchio probably told him it was an interview for the DVD making of feature or something like that, and then just spliced it into his campaign ad. In case you were wondering, Del Vecchio lost his race for the Senate in New Jersey in 2011 really badly, and he lost again in a 2016 Republican primary. He hasn't run for office since. What I was struck most by The Life Zone is how much it hates women. They are, at best, like the conservative women, pliable and submissive. The women who show any sign of agency are presented as dangerous. The doctor seems like a strange exception to this. She isn't allowed to be evil by her own design. She is instead a literal tool of the devil. But the submissiveness of women is constantly held up as a good or moral choice. It's a bit of a trend I see in all of these movies. Women aren't expected to make any choices, unless it's one of the choices that have been already decided for them. The Life Zone is remarkably bland. As far as movie goes, it doesn't really have anything to say that isn't slamming you right on the head. Looking at the abortion debate segments, I'm not even sure if it represents the anti-choice side very well. But it did make me wonder, if being in hell means having to watch anti-choice movies, then what am I doing to myself with this video? I need to move on to the conclusion before I figure out the answer to that question. An article in Vox written in 2019 about Unplanned captured an important moment. It reads, anti-abortion documentaries have been around for decades, dating back to 1984's The Silent Scream. Gretchen Sisson, a sociologist and the leader of the Abortion on Screen project at the organization Advancing New Standards in Reproductive Health, told Vox. But scripted anti-abortion films like Sarah's Choice and Gosnell became more common in the past decade, as advocates on both sides of the issue began to embrace narrative as a persuasive tool. This, by the way, is contrasted against people on the pro-choice side using real-life narratives and spreading them on social media. The article later mentions remarks from the creators of Unplanned about how movies like theirs were on a mission to change the conversation around Roe v. Wade and hopefully overturn that ruling. This is something I suspect many of the other filmmakers similarly felt. Here we are 6 years later, and they seem to have gotten the result they wanted. The right to an abortion has been removed at the federal level in the United States, and now people are suffering those consequences. But when looking at these movies, can anyone say they honestly know of or noticed any of them? I'm sure a few of you in the audience can remember one or two, but those of you in that group, how many of you went to see them? And in that smaller group, how many of you actually had your mind changed? I know my audience is generally on the more left side of things, so maybe that's not an entirely fair question. But looking at the box office results, the more successful ones seem to have been Unplanned, with less than $22 million earned worldwide. Not the most striking of results, and certainly not something that reflects a society-changing movie. These filmmakers claim they wanted to change the conversation about this, but these movies don't represent any meaningful form of persuasion. What overturned Roe v. Wade was not movies that changed the hearts of a nation. It was the anti-choice movement's proximity to power, to function as a voting bloc that can serve as a resource in an electoral system. This isn't to say that these movies were entirely pointless. In spite of what the filmmakers say, these movies aren't about convincing people on the other side. Rather, they are to convince their own side to stay angry and riled up, something that you can get through highly charged and violent imagery of babies being murdered. A movie like Bella, for instance, is a lot less likely to inspire righteous anger than one like Unplanned, so I'm not surprised the latter movie earned nearly twice as much at the box office. That, I think, reflects the fragility of the anti-choice crowd, that their bad arguments need to be repeated by even worse art. They are constantly propagandizing themselves. Although the left supposedly controls Hollywood, there is no equivalent of these movies being constantly churned out. If some kind of massive left-wing agenda were really driving Hollywood, you'd think Captain America would have come to the rescue of an abortion clinic at this point. When looking up these movies, I looked at Christian websites that were talking about movies that had a pro-life message, and I saw so many Hollywood movies being co-opted into their movement. They would often mention movies like Knocked Up, Juno, or in one weird case, Aliens, as movies that had a strong pro-life message. Maybe it's just defensiveness because the movies I highlighted in this video are pretty bad. But I think these websites also reflect that insecurity. To want to see yourself in movies, but in a way that reaffirms a belief that you must know is out of step with a significant percentage of the population in your own country. For all the weakness in these arguments and their desperate attempt to be part of the cultural zeitgeist, the real lesson is probably that having access to the levers of power can sometimes matter more than the popularity or strength of your arguments. And access to that power isn't derived from popular opinion, but having enough people motivated through media to reach a political goal. If you're perhaps hoping for a recommendation for a movie that treats the subject matter with a bit more respect and artistry, I'd recommend the movie Never, Rarely, Sometimes, Always by Eliza Hittman. This movie looks at abortion through the lens of someone who chooses to get one that feels so much more real and moving than any of the other movies I mentioned in this video. And yes, it's significantly better than Bella. The movie doesn't feel the need to preach anything. It simply depicts one girl's story and lets the audience see into that experience that exists outside of political debate and into a personal reality. Because as much as the subject gets treated like a political football, it's important to understand this is a real issue that affects the lives of actual people. Movies like the ones I highlighted in this video often seem to lose the thread of that. For any Americans struggling to get this particular right back, remember to stay organized. It's a winning issue electorally. And in the meantime, look locally to groups that help with reproductive care. I've linked a few resources below for anyone interested in learning more. Gosh, this was a wild one. I actually had to watch several movies that I didn't even mention in this video because they just weren't that interesting. If you've ever been forced to sit through any of these, you have my sympathies. Unless you got to make a YouTube out of it like me, then, it's your job, isn't it? If you want to see me keep doing this job, do consider becoming a patron or member to the channel like the fine folks whose name you can see on the screen now. They get early access to videos, their name in the credits, of course, and other fun bonuses I throw in from time to time. If you'd like to support this channel in a non-monetary fashion, you can like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell for notifications, or share this video on social media. Thank you all so much for watching.